Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Rankle, Master of Pranks. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Rankle, Master of Pranks is a 3/3 legendary fairy rogue that costs 2 generic and 2 black to cast, with flying and haste. And, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we can choose any number of 3 effects. Having everyone discard a card, having everyone lose life and draw a card, and or having everyone sacrifice a creature, which gives us a number of potential build paths for a Rankle deck depending on how heavily you want to focus on any given ability. For this particular deck, we'll focus more heavily on having players draw and discard cards while still providing some chaff for the sacking ability. Since we'll be drawing and discarding a bunch, we'll have a number of effects that damage or make our opponents lose life for doing so, though we will have a number of other effects in this deck that trigger off of players drawing and discarding. And so we're not ignoring Rankle's final ability, we'll also have a handful of cards in this deck that are either themselves great to sacrifice, such as low drop Resurrectable Creatures, or make consistent creature tokens that we can sack. But with that, let's start getting into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. And I'll start with our land-based ramp, where we have Wayfarer's Bauble and Solemn Simulacrum. The former can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the Sad Robot lets you tutor a basic onto the battlefield tapped as an ETB effect, but it can also be great to sack with Rankle since we get to draw for doing so. Then for a bunch of mana rocks, Mind Stone, Prismatic Lens, Liquimetal Torque, and the Iron Crag will all tap for generic mana. Charcoal Diamond will tap for black mana. Fellwar Stone will likely tap for black mana. Arcane Signet and Sonic Screwdriver will also tap for black mana, while Sonic Screwdriver can also be used to scry or to make a creature unblockable for the turn so we can ensure that Rankle gets through on somebody. And finally, we have Gauntlet of Power, which has you choose a color upon entering the battlefield, and then creatures of that color get +1/+1, and lands being tapped for mana of that color make an additional mana of that color. But now let's take a look at the creatures that we can easily sacrifice, or sources of creature tokens for that purpose. First up are a couple of creatures that give us benefits when they die, namely Greedy Freebooter and Corpse Augur, the former being a 1-drop creature that lets us scry and it replaces itself with a treasure token when it dies, and the latter being an okay source of draw, as when Corpse Augur dies, we draw X and lose X life, where X is the number of creature cards in a target graveyard. And between the sack and discard abilities with Rankle, there's likely going to be a graveyard with a decent number of creatures in it by the time you're looking to use this effect. And up next are Reassembling Skeleton, Bloodsoaked Champion, and Haunt of the Dead Marshes, each of which can be returned to the battlefield from the graveyard as an activated ability, though Bloodsoaked Champion requires you to attack that turn, and Haunt of the Dead Marshes requires you to control a legendary creature to do so. And then for creature tokens, Mardu Strike Leader makes a 2/1 Black Warrior creature token whenever it attacks, but it also has a dash alternate cost which lets you cast it with haste, attack that turn, and then it returns to your hand at the beginning of your next end step. Jadar, Ghoul Color of Nephalia, will consistently produce sack fodder, as it makes a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed at the beginning of your end step, provided you don't control any creatures with Decayed, which really incentivizes to sack or otherwise deal with our Decayed creatures before our end steps. And then to play off the discard, we have the Raven Man and Dying to Serve, the former making a 1/1 bird creature token with flying that can't block at the beginning of any end step where a player discarded a card that turn, and Dying to Serve makes a tapped 2/2 zombie creature token whenever you discard 1 or more cards, though it only triggers once per turn. But now let's go over the cards whose abilities will trigger as we go about doing Rankle things. First up, Megrim, Raider's Wake, and Fell Spectre either deal 2 damage or make opponents lose 2 life whenever they discard a card, with Fell Spectre additionally having a target opponent discard a card when it enters the battlefield, and Raider's Wake doing the same during your end step provided you attacked with a creature that turn. Sangromancer is a great way to up our life totals a bit, especially since drawing with Rankle will ping us as well, as we may gain 3 life whenever an opponent's creature dies, or whenever an opponent discards card. Waste Not gives a few fun effects when our opponents discard, depending on what's being discarded. Most notably, a discarded creature card gives us a 2/2 black zombie creature token, and a non-creature non-land card lets us draw a card. Then Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or whenever a creature card leaves our graveyard, while also having the activated ability to make everyone mill a card. Then, as we plan on forcing everyone to draw with some regularity, Underworld Dreams and Fate Unraveler will punish our opponents for doing so, as they deal 1 damage to any opponent drawing a card. Then we have a few cards that trigger off of us drawing and discarding, with Feast of Sanity dealing 1 damage to any target while we gain a life whenever we discard, Faith of the Devoted making each opponent lose 2 life and ourselves gain 2 if we pay 1 generic mana when we discard or cycle, and Archfiend of Ifnir puts a -1/-1 counter on each of our opponent's creatures whenever we discard or cycle. Then Gixian Puppeteer has each opponent lose 2 life and ourselves gain 2 whenever we draw our second card in a given turn, and we can also return a creature card with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard onto the battlefield when it dies. And finally, Psychosis Crawler has each opponent lose a life whenever we draw a card, while its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards we have in hand. Now I'd like to make a quick tangent and talk about a handful of cards that don't fit super well into any given chapter, but can play decently in a Rankle deck. Necrogoyf has its power equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards, which our discard and sacking effects should help with, while also making each player discard a card at the beginning of their upkeeps. Additionally, Necrogoyf has a Madness alternate casting cost, making this a good card to consider discarding with Rankle, as we can cast it for cheaper than going straight from our hand, while also making everyone else discard. Fire Shrieker can let us give Rankle Double Strike, which has creatures deal combat damage twice, and thus lets us potentially access Rankle's abilities twice in a given turn. Painful Conjure plays even more into the discard side of this deck, as it makes opponents choose between losing 5 life or discarding a card whenever they cast a spell. Then Massacre Worm will frequently lend to a decent amount of life loss when cast, as it gives our opponent's creatures -2/-2 for the turn when it enters the battlefield, which will likely wipe out at least a few creatures. Then whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, they lose 2 life. This could also play well into Rankle's sack effect whenever we have our tokens and sack fodder around. And, for a bit more of a good stuffs card, Gary, Grey Merchant of Asphodel, has each opponent lose X life, with X being our devotion to black, and us gain as much life as the life that was lost this way when it enters the battlefield. With that though, let's start looking at our sources of draw and card advantage. Starting off with Sign in Blood, Read the Bones, and Siphon Mind. With Sign in Blood simply having a target player draw 2 and lose 2 life, Read the Bones having you scry 2, and then draw 2 and lose 2 life, and Siphon Mind has each other player discard a card, and you draw a card for each card that was discarded this way, so upwards of drawing 3 in a typical Commander game. Then we have Village Rites and Altar's Reap, which have us draw 2, but also require us to sack a creature to cast them. Similar to those are Costly Plunder and Reckoner's Bargain, which also have us draw 2, but we can sack a creature or artifact to cast this instead of only sacking creatures. Reckoner's Bargain also gives you life equal to the sacked permanent's mana value. Then Endless Atlas lets us draw by tapping it with 2 mana, though we need to control 3 lands of the same name to access this ability, though as we'll get onto later, we have a ton of basic swamps in this deck, so this should be a pretty easy hurdle to get over. And Underworld Connections is an aura that enchants a land, which lets us tap that land and pay 1 life to draw a card. Then Rankle having some built-in evasion and requiring us to deal combat damage to access his ability also lends well to cards like Rogue's Gloves and Mask of Memory, which let us draw when their equipped creature deals combat damage to a player. Rogue's Glove specifically letting us draw 1, and Mask of Memory having us draw 2, but we discard a card so we only get to net 1 card. And finally, playing off the discard aspect of this deck, Guess Grimoire lets us draw a card whenever an opponent discards a card, so potentially plenty of draw for us whenever Rankle deals combat damage. And Containment Construct isn't exactly card draw, but it gives us the chance to still play the cards we're discarding with Rankle, which can make the decision of discarding less challenging or painful when you have a handful of great cards that you'd loathe to lose, but you still want our opponents to discard. Now let's move on to the spells that will let us interact more directly with what our opponents are doing, as the creature getting sacked from Rankle's ability is still at our opponent's discretion, and we'll also go over a few ways to keep Rankle around longer, as we plan on putting him into the line of fire frequently to access his abilities. I'll start with Doomblade, Go for the Throat, and Feed the Swarm for some creature destruction. Doomblade specifically dealing with non-black creatures, Go for the Throat for non-artifact creatures, and Feed the Swarm can target any creature or enchantment, but we lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. We then have Dark Withering to destroy a target non-black creature, which is a little bit harder to use as we'll really want to cast it for its madness cost. Then, in case we need to deal with a creature with Indestructible, we have Defile and Tragic Slip, the former giving a target creature -1/-1 for the turn for each swamp that we control, and the latter giving a target creature -1/-1 for the turn, or -13/-13 if a creature had died that turn. Then, if things really start getting out of hand, we have Deadly Tempest and Decree of Pain for some board wipes, the former destroying all creatures and then having players lose life equal to the number of creatures they controlled lost this way, and the latter destroying all creatures and having us draw a card for each creature destroyed this way. We could also cycle Decree of Pain away for 3 less mana, and we'd still get a Weenies board wipe, as all creatures will still get -2/-2 for the turn when the spell is cycled. Then, since we'll be putting Rankle out into combat frequently, and having to pay 6+ mana to get our commander to come back is a pain even if Rankle has haste, we have a few cards to help us keep him around longer. To start, Fungal Fortitude is an aura enchantment with flash that gives its enchanted creature +2 power, but also, when the enchanted creature dies, we return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Then we have Kaya's Ghost Form, a 1-drop aura that has us return the enchanted creature to the battlefield under its owner's control if it dies or is put into exile. And Not Dead After All, which is a 1-drop instant letting us return a target creature to the battlefield under its owner's control with a Wicked Roll token aura on it if it died. With that aura giving the creature +1/+1 and making each opponent lose a life if that aura is put into a graveyard. And finally for this section, Mirror Shield and Whisper Silk Cloak will make Rankle hard to target, as the former gives Hexproof and +2 toughness, and the latter gives Shroud, and also makes the creature unblockable to boot. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's take a quick look at our land base. To start, we have a couple of cycling lands with Barren Moor and Polluted Mire, in case we draw them at a time we'd really prefer spells over lands. Myriad Landscape can act as a bit of land-based ramp, as can be sacked to tutor 2 basic lands of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Mortuary Mire lets us put a target creature card from our graveyard on top of our library when it enters the battlefield. Then Gaia Reach Sanitarium makes it so each player draws and discards a card. And then Axis Tunnel and Rogue's Passage can help us ensure that Rankle gets through onto somebody if, by some unfortunate circumstance, all of our opponents have flyers or creatures with reach. Though note that Axis Tunnel does require us to not buff Rankle's power any further. And War Room is yet another source of draw for this deck. And finally, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 27 basic swamps. But now that we've gone through all of the cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing just under $44.50 at the time of recording, which does include our basics at 10 cents a piece, but this won't take into account things like shipping. But before ending this video, I'd like to go over a handful of cards you may wish to consider if you'd like to build this deck with a bit higher budget. Liliana's Caress fits perfectly into this deck, as opponents lose 2 life whenever they discard a card. It's just a bit more financially expensive than the other cards with similar effects already in this deck. Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal does many of the things we want to do in this deck, having each opponent discard a card whenever it attacks, letting us draw for each opponent who can't discard, and it makes 1/1 bat creature tokens with flying as potential sack fodder whenever an opponent discards a land. And it's difficult to deal with fully as it returns transformed as a land when it dies, with that land having a way of transforming back into the creature. Then Bone Miser turns us discarding into a bit of a positive, as it's basically Waste Not that triggers off of what we discard instead of what our opponents discard. And speaking on us discarding, Currency Converter can also let us get a little bit of extra value from the cards that we discard, as it lets us instead exile those cards, and we can then tap Currency Converter to put one of those exiled cards into our graveyard, and then either making a treasure token if it were a land card, or a 2/2 black rogue creature token if it were a non-land card. And then Library of Lang effectively lets us skirt around our discard if we wish, as we skip our discard phase entirely, and whenever we're forced to discard via a spell or an effect, we can instead discard that card on top of our library. But regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, maybe give it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander builds, consider dropping a sub. But with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.